They say some secrets die with the people who keep them. But what happens when the weight of those secrets becomes too heavy to bear? For 50 years, one man stood silent, watching from the shadows, protecting America's most beloved First Lady. He was there during her most vulnerable moments, witnessed her private tears, and heard the confessions she would never share with the world. Now, decades later, that silence has been broken. What he reveals about Jackie Kennedy will change everything you thought you knew about Camelot, about Grace Under Pressure, and about the woman behind the pearls and pillbox hat. This isn't just another story about a tragic presidency or a famous assassination. This is the untold truth about Jackie Kennedy's deepest pain, her carefully hidden struggles, and the tragic secret she carried until her final days. A secret so profound that even her own children didn't know the full extent of it. And it all comes from the one man who was closest to her when the camera stopped rolling and the public facade finally crumbled. Imagine being so close to someone that you know their every fear, witness their every breakdown, yet you're sworn to never speak of it. That was the reality for Clint Hill, Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service agent, the man who literally took a bullet meant for her, the man who climbed onto the back of that limousine in Dallas, and the man who would carry the psychological scars of November 22nd, 1963, for the rest of his life. But his story isn't just about that fateful day in Dallas. It's about the years before and after, about a woman who is drowning in expectations, suffocated by protocol, and haunted by losses that the American public never fully understood. When Clint Hill finally decided to break his silence after half a century, he didn't just share memories of a glamorous First Lady. He revealed a portrait of a woman in constant pain, fighting battles no one could see, wearing a mask of composure while everything inside her was falling apart. Jackie Kennedy has been mythologized, idolized, and analyzed for generations. We think we know her story, the fairy tale wedding to the charismatic young senator, the picture-perfect family in the White House, the restoration of American culture and elegance, and then the ultimate tragedy that turned her into a widow on live television. But what if everything we thought we knew was just the surface? What if the real Jackie Kennedy was someone entirely different from the icon we've created? What if her greatest performance wasn't standing beside world leaders or hosting state dinners, but simply getting through each day without letting anyone see how broken she really was? This is what Clint Hill wants the world to understand. The Jackie Kennedy he knew wasn't just a tragic figure because of Dallas. She was tragic long before that motorcade, and she remained tragic long after the funeral that captivated the world. The relationship between a Secret Service agent and their protectee is unlike any other. It requires absolute trust, constant proximity, and an unspoken understanding that transcends normal human boundaries. Clint Hill was assigned to Jackie Kennedy in 1960, just as her husband was launching his presidential campaign. From that moment, he became her shadow, her constant companion, and inadvertently, her confidant. He was there for the births and the deaths, the triumphs and the humiliations, the public spectacles and the private devastations. He saw her at her strongest and at her most vulnerable. And what he saw was a woman trapped in a gilded cage, playing a role she never wanted, sacrificing pieces of herself every single day to maintain an image that was slowly killing her from the inside. One of the first revelations Clint Hill shares is about Jackie's pregnancy struggles and the loss that nearly destroyed her even before the White House years. Before Caroline and John Jr. became the adorable children America fell in love with, there were other pregnancies, other hopes, and devastating losses. In 1955, Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter they'd planned to name Arabella. The grief from this loss was something she never fully recovered from. Unlike today, when pregnancy loss is discussed more openly, in the 1950s and 60s, women were expected to suffer silently, to move on quickly, and to try again without dwelling on their pain. Jackie was no exception. She was told to be strong, to support her husband's political ambitions, and to present a perfect image to the world. But inside, she was shattered. The loss of Arabella created a wound that would never fully heal, and it was the first of many tragedies that would define her life. Clint Hill observed how this loss affected Jackie in ways that those around her either didn't notice or chose to ignore. She would have periods of deep melancholy, times when the vivacious socialite would retreat into herself, becoming almost unreachable. During the presidential campaign, when she should have been energized and excited about the possibility of becoming First Lady, there were days when she could barely function. She would cancel appearances, claiming illness or exhaustion, but Clint could see it was something deeper. It was a grief that had nowhere to go, a pain that had no outlet, because admitting vulnerability wasn't part of the Kennedy way. The Kennedys were winners, fighters, people who overcame adversity with charm and determination. There was no room for prolonged sadness, for unresolved trauma, or for acknowledging that some wounds don't heal just because time passes. When Jackie did become First Lady in 1961, the pressure intensified exponentially. She was now living under constant scrutiny, with every outfit analyzed, every facial expression interpreted, and every public appearance critiqued by millions. The restoration of the White House, which is now celebrated as one of her greatest achievements, was actually a form of therapy for her, according to Clint Hill's observations. It gave her a project she could control, a space where her choices mattered, and an opportunity to create beauty in an environment that often felt cold and impersonal. But even this project came with its own pressures. She was criticized for spending too much money, accused of being pretentious for caring about antiques and historical accuracy, and constantly compared to the more politically active first ladies who had come before her. The public wanted her to be perfect but not too perfect, elegant but not too sophisticated, involved but not too political. It was an impossible standard, and it took its toll. What most people don't realize is that during those years in the White House, Jackie was also dealing with another pregnancy and another devastating loss. In August 1963, just 3 months before Dallas, Jackie gave birth to Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, a premature baby who died just 2 days after birth due to respiratory complications. This loss devastated her in ways that the public never fully saw. The official photos showed a grieving but composed First Lady standing beside her husband, receiving condolences with dignity. But Clint Hill saw what happened behind closed doors. He saw a mother completely broken, inconsolable, questioning why she couldn't carry a healthy baby to term, blaming herself for something that was beyond her control. The loss of Patrick wasn't just another tragedy. It was a confirmation of her deepest fears that something was fundamentally wrong, that happiness was always going to be snatched away just when it seemed within reach. John F. Kennedy, for all his public charm and political brilliance, was not the supportive husband Jackie needed during this time. His infidelities were numerous and barely concealed. While Jackie was recovering from Patrick's death, dealing with post-pregnancy complications and overwhelming grief, her husband's affairs continued. Clint Hill never explicitly states the names or details in his initial revelations, but he makes it clear that Jackie knew about the other women. She knew about the White House staffers, the Hollywood actresses, the socialites who found their way into her husband's bed while she was traveling or recovering from childbirth. This knowledge was its own kind of torture. She couldn't leave him without destroying his political career and her children's stability. She couldn't confront him publicly without causing a scandal that would overshadow everything else. So she did what many women of her era did. She endured. She stayed. She played her role. And with each affair, with each humiliation, something inside her died a little more. The Secret Service agents, including Clint Hill, were in the impossible position of witnessing these indiscretions while maintaining their professional obligations. They saw the women coming and going. They facilitated the logistics that made the affairs possible, even if inadvertently. And they saw how it affected Jackie. There were times when she would discover evidence of an affair, a lipstick stain, a personal item left behind, whispered conversations she wasn't meant to overhear, and the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. But by the next public appearance, she would be composed again, smiling at her husband's side, playing the role of the devoted wife. This constant performance required a strength that most people couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances. It was about surviving with her dignity intact when every private betrayal became a public humiliation that she couldn't acknowledge. The trip to Dallas in November 1963 was meant to be a political necessity, a fence-mending tour in a state where Kennedy's support was shaky. Jackie almost didn't go. She was still recovering emotionally and physically from Patrick's death just 3 months earlier. She wanted to stay with Caroline and John Jr., to retreat from the public eye and process her grief in private. But she was convinced that her presence was needed, that her popularity could help smooth over political tensions, that it was her duty as First Lady. So she went, wearing that famous pink Chanel suit, smiling and waving to the crowds in Dallas, once again putting aside her own needs for the sake of political expediency. Clint Hill was in the follow-up car, just feet away from her, doing what he had done for years, watching, protecting, anticipating threats. But no one anticipated what would happen next. The assassination of President Kennedy has been analyzed from every possible angle: the ballistics, the conspiracy theories, the political implications, the security failures. But Clint Hill's account focuses on something different: what it was like for Jackie in those moments and the days that followed. When the shots rang out, Clint's immediate instinct was to get to Jackie. He ran toward the presidential limousine, climbed onto the back of the moving vehicle, and pushed Jackie back into her seat. In the most famous and horrifying piece of footage from that day, we see Jackie climbing onto the trunk of the car, and for years people speculated about what she was doing. Some said she was trying to escape. Others suggested she was in shock, moving without conscious thought. But Clint Hill knows the truth because he was there. She was reaching for a piece of her husband's skull that had been blown onto the trunk of the car. In her shock and desperation, some instinct made her try to retrieve it, as if somehow she could put him back together, as if she could undo what had just happened. The drive to Parkland Hospital was a nightmare. Jackie was covered in her husband's blood, cradling his shattered head in her lap, refusing to let go of him even as doctors tried to help. Clint Hill was beside her, knowing that the president was already dead or dying, knowing that nothing could be done, but unable to say it out loud. When they finally arrived at the hospital and the president was taken into the trauma room, Jackie wanted to follow, but was told to wait outside. She stood in that hospital corridor, still wearing the blood-soaked pink suit, in shock but somehow still processing the political implications of what had just happened. When Lyndon Johnson's people started discussing the swearing-in ceremony, Jackie understood immediately that she had a role to play even in this moment of unimaginable grief. She decided to stay in her bloody clothes for the swearing-in aboard Air Force One, telling people that she wanted the world to see what they had done. It was a decision made in trauma, but it was also a politically brilliant move that turned her instantly into a symbol of the nation's loss. The days following the assassination are when Clint Hill witnessed the full extent of Jackie's strength and her devastation. She planned every detail of the funeral with meticulous precision, modeling it after Abraham Lincoln's funeral, making sure it would be a historic event worthy of a fallen president. She walked behind the caisson carrying her husband's casket, refusing to ride in a car, showing the world a picture of dignified grief that has become iconic. But Clint saw what happened in between those public moments. He saw her collapse when the cameras were gone. He heard her sobbing late at night. He witnessed her talking to her dead husband, asking him why he left her, apologizing for not being enough to make him faithful, blaming herself for encouraging him to go to Dallas. The guilt she carried wasn't rational, but grief rarely is. She felt she should have protected him somehow, should have seen the danger, should have done something different. And no amount of reassurance from Clint or anyone else could penetrate that guilt. One of the most tragic secrets Clint Hill reveals is about Jackie's mental state in the months following the assassination. While the public saw a brave widow rebuilding her life and protecting her children, privately Jackie was barely functioning. She had what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She had nightmares every night, reliving the assassination over and over. She couldn't stand the sound of motorcycles or cars backfiring because it reminded her of gunshots. She became hypervigilant about her children's safety, terrified that the same violence that took her husband would somehow claim them too. She drank more than was healthy, using alcohol to numb the pain and quiet the memories that haunted her every waking moment. She took pills to sleep, pills to function, pills to get through public appearances. This was the 1960s, when mental health treatment was primitive and stigmatized, especially for someone in her position. She couldn't exactly check into a psychiatric facility or openly admit she was struggling. So she suffered in silence, with only a few people like Clint Hill understanding the full extent of her psychological trauma. The decision to leave the White House and move to New York was about survival. Washington was full of memories and political expectations that she couldn't bear anymore. Every location reminded her of something, where they had walked together, where they had argued, where she had received the news about Patrick, where she had prepared for Dallas. New York offered anonymity, or at least the illusion of it. She could disappear into the city in a way that was impossible in Washington. But even in New York, the pain followed her. Clint Hill's assignment to protect her continued, and he watched as she tried to build a new life while carrying the weight of the old one. She was still young, only 34 years old when she became a widow, but she felt ancient. The trauma had aged her in ways that weren't visible in photographs. She would have moments of genuine joy, especially with her children, but they were always tinged with sadness, always shadowed by the knowledge of what had been lost. The relationship between Jackie and her children became the center of her existence, but it was also another source of pain. She wanted desperately to give them a normal childhood, to protect them from the legacy of violence and tragedy that surrounded their father's memory. But how do you raise children normally when their father was the President of the United States, assassinated in front of the world? How do you explain to them why people stare, why photographers follow them everywhere, why their lives will never be ordinary? She tried to shield them, even as she knew it was an impossible task. And there was always the guilt, the feeling that by marrying into the Kennedy family, by encouraging her husband's political ambitions, she had somehow set these children up for a life of scrutiny and danger they never asked for. Clint Hill also reveals details about Jackie's relationship with Robert Kennedy during this period. Bobby had always been closer to Jackie than most people realized, and after JFK's death, they became even more dependent on each other. They shared grief that no one else could fully understand. They had both loved Jack, despite his flaws, and they had both lost him in the most traumatic way possible. There has been much speculation over the years about whether their relationship became romantic, and while Clint Hill doesn't explicitly confirm this, he makes it clear that their bond was profound and complicated. When Bobby was assassinated in 1968, Jackie lost not just her brother-in-law but the one person who truly understood her experience. This second assassination reopened all the wounds from Dallas and added new layers of trauma. She became even more convinced that the Kennedy family was cursed, that violence would always find them, and that she needed to protect her children from that legacy at all costs. This fear of the Kennedy curse, and her desire to protect her children from further tragedy, was a major factor in her decision to marry Aristotle Onassis in 1968. The American public was shocked and somewhat scandalized by this marriage. Here was America's tragic widow, the symbol of grace and dignity, marrying a much older, divorced Greek shipping magnate who was not particularly attractive and seemed to represent everything opposite to the ideals of Camelot. People called her a gold digger, accused her of betraying JFK's memory, and criticized her for choosing financial security over romantic love. But Clint Hill understood what most people didn't. She was terrified. She was exhausted from being a symbol, from living under constant scrutiny, from worrying every day about whether her children would be the next targets. Onassis offered her something she desperately needed: security, privacy, and physical distance from America and all its painful associations. He had his own island, his own security force, and enough money to create a protected environment where she and her children could simply exist without the constant pressure of public expectations. The marriage to Onassis was not a happy one in the traditional sense, according to Hill's observations during the times he still had contact with Jackie. Onassis was controlling and often humiliated her publicly by flaunting his relationship with opera singer Maria Callas. But Jackie had not married him for romance or companionship. She had married him for survival and protection. It was a transactional arrangement that gave her what she needed most: financial independence and the ability to control her own life in ways that hadn't been possible before. She could travel, make her own decisions, and most importantly, she could create the environment she wanted for Caroline and John Jr. When Onassis died in 1975, she was a widow again, but this time with the financial resources to never be dependent on anyone again. This financial independence became crucial to her ability to finally build a life on her own terms. In the years after Onassis's death, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, as she was now known, finally found some measure of peace. She worked as an editor at Doubleday, a job that gave her purpose and intellectual stimulation. She was no longer just a symbol or a widow or a former First Lady. She was a professional with her own accomplishments. She built meaningful relationships, maintained close bonds with her children, and became a grandmother. To outsiders, it seemed like she had finally found happiness after decades of tragedy. But Clint Hill, who maintained periodic contact with her over the years, knew that the wounds from her earlier life never fully healed. She still had nightmares about Dallas. She still dealt with anxiety and periods of deep sadness. She had learned to manage these feelings, to integrate them into her life without being completely consumed by them, but they never disappeared entirely. The tragic secret that Clint Hill refers to in his revelations isn't just one specific thing. It's the accumulation of hidden pain that Jackie carried throughout her life. It's the stillborn daughter no one talked about. It's the baby son who died after 2 days. It's the husband whose betrayals she endured in silence. It's the trauma of watching that husband murdered beside her. It's the post-traumatic stress she lived with for decades. It's the guilt she carried about not being able to save him. It's the fear that never left her about losing her children to the same violence. It's the sacrifice of her own identity and desires to maintain an image that everyone else needed her to be. It's the loneliness of being iconic, of being on a pedestal where no one can really reach you or understand you. It's the exhaustion of performing strength when you feel broken inside. All of these secrets, woven together, created the private Jackie Kennedy, the woman behind the carefully constructed public image. When Jackie was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1994, she faced her final challenge with the same complicated mixture of strength and vulnerability that had characterized her entire life. She was initially optimistic about treatment, but as the cancer progressed and the prognosis worsened, she made the decision to stop aggressive treatment and die on her own terms. She wanted to be at home, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, not in a hospital attached to machines. This final act of autonomy was important to her. After so many years of having her life controlled by circumstances, by expectations, by tragedy, she would at least control how her life ended. Clint Hill, though no longer her active protector, was devastated by her illness. The woman he had spent years protecting from physical threats was facing an enemy he couldn't defend her against. Jackie Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994, at the age of 64, in her apartment in New York City, with Caroline and John Jr. by her side. The world mourned the loss of a historic figure, a woman who had defined elegance and grace for generations. But Clint Hill mourned the loss of the real Jackie Kennedy, the complicated, wounded, resilient woman he had known behind the public facade. In the years after her death, he struggled with whether to share what he knew. On one hand, he felt a duty to protect her privacy, to maintain the professional silence that had been a cornerstone of his career. On the other hand, he felt that the world's understanding of Jackie Kennedy was so incomplete, so sanitized and mythologized, that it did her a disservice. The public worshipped an icon, but they never really knew the woman. And perhaps, he thought, she deserved to be known, to be understood not just as a symbol, but as a human being who had endured extraordinary pain while maintaining extraordinary dignity. When Clint Hill finally began speaking publicly about his experiences with Jackie Kennedy, more than 50 years after he was first assigned to protect her, his motivations were complex. He wasn't interested in sensationalism or in tarnishing her reputation. He had nothing to gain financially that would outweigh the emotional cost of reliving those memories. What he wanted was to tell the truth, not to destroy the legend of Jackie Kennedy, but to add depth and humanity to it. He wanted people to understand that her strength wasn't about being invulnerable or unaffected by tragedy. Her strength was about continuing to function, to love, to build a life despite being profoundly affected by trauma. She wasn't superhuman. She was human in the most fundamental sense, dealing with pain and loss and fear in the ways available to her given the constraints of her time and position. One of the most poignant aspects of Clint Hill's revelations is his own guilt and trauma related to the assassination. For decades, he blamed himself for not being fast enough, for not preventing the tragedy, for not somehow changing the outcome. He had nightmares too. He drank heavily. His marriage suffered. He withdrew from his family and struggled with depression. It wasn't until many years later, with proper therapy and support, that he began to understand he had done everything humanly possible in those terrible seconds in Dallas. But the trauma had bonded him to Jackie in a way that transcended their professional relationship. They were both survivors of the same event, both carrying wounds that others couldn't see. In some ways, his decision to finally speak about his experiences was part of his own healing process, a way of honoring her memory by ensuring that her true story was told. The legacy of Jackie Kennedy is complicated by these revelations. On one hand, knowing about her private struggles and hidden pain makes her public composure even more remarkable. She wasn't effortlessly graceful. She was deliberately, consciously choosing grace despite having every reason to crumble. She wasn't naturally strong. She built her strength piece by piece, day by day, often while falling apart in private. This makes her humanity more relatable and her achievements more impressive. On the other hand, her story is a cautionary tale about the costs of maintaining a public image, about the damage caused by forcing people, especially women, into roles that don't allow for vulnerability or imperfection. How much of Jackie's suffering was necessary? How much was caused by the expectations placed upon her, the impossibility of the standards she was required to meet, the lack of support and understanding for her very real psychological needs? The tragedy of Jackie Kennedy's secret isn't just what she endured, it's that she felt she had to endure it alone and in silence. In today's world, with more open discussions about mental health, trauma, pregnancy loss, and complicated grief, would Jackie have suffered less? Would she have had access to better treatment, more understanding, permission to be publicly imperfect? We can't know for certain, but it's worth considering. Her story reminds us that behind every public figure, behind every seemingly perfect life, there are private struggles that we never see. It reminds us that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about continuing to move forward even when you're broken. And it reminds us that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people is to allow them to be human, to be imperfect, to struggle without losing our respect and admiration. Clint Hill's decision to break his 50-year silence wasn't about betrayal, it was about completion. He carried Jackie's secrets for her while she lived, protecting her privacy as part of his duty to protect her. But after her death, after decades of watching the public memory of her become increasingly mythologized and distant from reality, he felt a responsibility to tell the truth. Not the tabloid truth, not the sensational truth, but the human truth. Jackie Kennedy wasn't a saint or a symbol or a flawless icon. She was a woman who loved deeply, suffered profoundly, lost impossibly, and somehow continued to walk through the world with her head held high. That's the real story. That's the legacy worth remembering. And that's the tragic secret that can finally be told. Jackie Kennedy was human, beautifully and painfully human, and that humanity made her not less remarkable, but infinitely more so. The revelations from Clint Hill have changed how historians and the public think about Jackie Kennedy. We can no longer see her simply as the elegant First Lady in perfect outfits, or as the tragic widow in the blood-stained suit, or as the mysterious figure who married for money. We have to see her as all of these things and more, as a mother, a daughter, a woman, a survivor. We have to acknowledge that her life was not a fairy tale, not even a tragedy in the clean, dramatic sense, but rather a complex human experience filled with joy and pain, strength and vulnerability, public performance and private suffering. Understanding this doesn't diminish her. It enriches our appreciation of what she accomplished and what she sacrificed. For those who lived through the Kennedy era, these revelations may be painful. The mythology of Camelot has been a source of comfort and inspiration for generations. The idea that there was once a moment of beauty and promise in American politics, embodied by the young, attractive president and his elegant wife, has sustained people through decades of increasingly cynical and divisive political environments. Learning that the reality was much darker, that even in that golden moment there was hidden pain and private tragedy, can feel like losing something precious. But perhaps there's another way to look at it. Perhaps the real lesson is that beauty and pain coexist, that grace can be chosen even in the midst of suffering, and that hope doesn't require perfection. Jackie Kennedy's true story is actually more inspiring than the myth because it shows us that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can choose dignity, can choose to keep going, can choose to build something meaningful even when everything inside them is broken. The question that remains is, what would Jackie herself think about these revelations? Would she be angry at Clint Hill for breaking his silence? Would she feel betrayed? Or would she perhaps feel relieved that the truth is finally known, that she no longer has to be just an icon but can be remembered as a complete person? We can't know for certain, but based on what we do know about her, it seems likely that she would have mixed feelings. She valued privacy intensely and worked hard to protect her children from public scrutiny. She would probably not want every detail of her suffering exposed for public consumption. But she was also intelligent and self-aware enough to recognize that the public image of her was incomplete and in some ways false. She knew that the real Jackie Kennedy was more complicated, more interesting, and more human than the symbol she had become. Perhaps she would appreciate that Clint Hill waited until long after her death, until her children were adults who could handle these revelations, and that he told his story with respect and love rather than sensationalism. In the end, the tragic secret of Jackie Kennedy is this: she was expected to be perfect in an imperfect world, to be strong when she was breaking, to be gracious when she was grieving, to be a symbol when she wanted to be simply human. The real tragedy isn't just what happened to her, the losses, the betrayals, the violence, the trauma. The real tragedy is that she felt she had to hide all of it, that showing vulnerability would have been seen as weakness, that admitting struggle would have been considered failure. She lived in an era and a position that demanded constant performance, and the cost of that performance was her ability to fully process and heal from the wounds she carried. Clint Hill's revelations don't change the facts of her life, but they change our understanding of what those facts meant to her, how she experienced them, and what it cost her to maintain the grace and dignity that defined her public image. She was not effortlessly elegant. She was determinately elegant despite overwhelming reasons not to be. And that determination, that choice to maintain dignity in the face of devastation, is perhaps the most powerful part of her legacy, not because it was easy, but because it was nearly impossible, and she did it anyway.